How to be French. Stereotype version. Show as much chest hair as possible. Even if you're a lady. Have stupid facial hair. Oui, oui. Always have a cigarette. Know how to paint. Say oui, oui a lot. Oui, oui. Oui, oui. Oh, oui, oui, bonjour. Oh, oui, oui. Oui, oui. You better get bread. Don't have any bread. Don't shower for weeks. Oh. Be scared of things. Be incredibly. You are fat. I realize this is incredibly offensive if you're French, so...
Have a nice day.
So that was our introduction on French culture, stereotypically speaking. And we're going to go through French history, religion in France, the food of France, and then post-World War II jazz in France. According to with French history, a rich history makes for a rich culture, which we've learned in class. And there's a quote by Triandus that's actually from a book which accurately describes how history and culture go hand in hand. Culture is a set of human-made objective and subjective elements that in the past have increased probability of survival and that have resulted in satisfaction. Thus, it has become shared among those who can communicate with each other because they hold a common language and live at the same place at the same time. History reflects everyone's culture, and then as we've been learning all semester, our culture reflects our communication, which in turn basically reflects how we communicate interculturally. So a little bit of background on history, or on France. It was one of the earliest countries to progress from feudalism to the nation state, and feudalism is basically where services or labors would be exchanged, or even relationships were formed around a certain amount of land that someone would hold. So they were the first nation to transfer from that to a nation state. They're the third largest country in Europe with almost 65 million people, which makes it a pretty dominant power, and it made it a pretty dominant power back then. And it has been noted that they've had very innovative and disciplined armies as well as very ambitious armies. So a couple of significant events in their history that kind of lead, or that kind of reflects their communication for today. One is specifically being the 100 Years' War, which was between 1328 and 1453. And it was between England and France, and basically it was a series of different battles over 100 years, which was battling over the control of the French throne. This event marks a really significant political and military growth in France. After this event led to a more modern France, and where the political power was dispersed among the nation. And because the political power was dispersed so widely, people wanted to hold on to their French local identities and just hold that on to them because it's becoming so stratified. And people started to say or call themselves Bon Francois, which means good French or good Frenchman. Even though that the 100 Years' War was mainly a dynastic war amongst powers in the kingdom, basically it gave impetus to the idea of French nationalism for a couple reasons. One, there was new military tactics and strategies, and this is one of the first standing armies since the Western Roman Empire. The face of France was constantly on the brink of war during this time between the international and imperial powers. World War II is another event that can reflect the communication in history, or communication in France, because their history, it kind of reflects an ethnocentrism. World War II, they were forced to go into World War II with Britain because of Germany's invasion of Poland. And when France entered the war, the Nazis ended up occupying about 2/3 of France's territory, and they fell in the 1940s. And because they fought on their soil, it kind of instilled a sense of pride with France. And then, France kind of had, with their communication, they hold an ethnocentrism with it. They really revere and they hold in high regard their rich history and their independence and everything that they've gone through. And some of the research that I did actually, citizens of France really respect it if people from other cultures know a little bit about their history, and they really enjoy having everyday conversations and almost debates about different events in their history and what has happened about their independence. They really like having invigorating conversations about it. Also, in everyday life in Paris, they're surrounded by their history. The Arc de Triomphe is a historical monument which basically gives honor to those who died in the French Revolutionary War. The Eiffel Tower is one that is also an item of history, and the Louvre, which is a historical art museum. And basically, since they're surrounded this in everyday life, they're almost surrounded by their history, and they're very proud of it, and they revere it. And now I was going to touch a little bit on the general history of France. Eric is going to talk about the religious history.
So I'm going to briefly go over religion in France. And the thing about religion is it's a very dynamic force. It's not static. And because of that, it changes over time, meaning that we have to look at the history to understand where we are today. And so I'm going to briefly go over where France is in terms of religion. France right now is fairly secular. They do not have an official religion, despite the fact that they have cathedrals all about. The percentage of Christianity in France, as you can see, is about 58%. Now this compares to the U.S. The U.S. is about 78%, and unaffiliated is 31%. That's twice the amount of unaffiliated people in France than in the U.S. So I'm going to talk a bit about the history now. So France was known as the Church's eldest daughter, meaning that it was extremely deeply rooted in Catholicism. And during a period of France's history, there were wars between the Protestants, the Huguenots, and Calvinists, and the Catholic Church. And these wars go deeper than just religion. These wars were based in politics too, because religion at the time was so interwoven with society as a whole. The Catholic Church was directly connected to the throne. And because of that, Protestants took on a leftist side. And there was an event called the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, in which 10 to 30,000 people were killed in the streets. Protestants were killed by other civilians. And so religion was really a source of tension for the French. When the French would think of religion, they associated with all this turmoil, this conflict. And it wasn't until Henry IV in 1598 created the Edict of Nantes, in which they separated church and state by declaring that you could have a civil status and a religious status. Now this was unheard of the time when rulers would divide up, wouldn't divide anything up. They would make it one country, one religion. So this was pretty groundbreaking that in the 16th century, the French already had the division of church and state. So this moves me on to my next point, which is the Enlightenment. And I'm going to start with a big cultural piece for the French, which is an encyclopédie, which was done by Denis Diderot. And this was important because instead of placing value on text, on scripture, it placed it on empiricism. It was an attempt to gather all the world's knowledge into one source where others could debate and weigh it out. And it sort of democratized truth. And what this did was further the idea of secularism in France. And eventually out of the Enlightenment came the idea of natural law. And what natural law is, it's an idea that you have rights, despite your religious identity, that are that pertain only to you, that cannot be changed. And this sort of moved into human rights. And again, it moved us past the religious divide, and it made the French more tolerant of other religions and thus more secular. And during the Revolution, it was kind of when the country as a whole internalized these values of the Enlightenment. The country implemented natural law, and the political implications were pretty severe as well. But the most important thing, too, that you have to realize, even though the country stood behind this idea of secularism and such that were declared in the Declarations of the Right of Man, there was still a lot of religious turmoil. There was still a lot of anti-Semitism. In 1791, the National Assembly did not grant Jewish citizens civil rights under the now divided church and state government, which is pretty interesting to see. And I'm going to go on to talk about how those problems in France exist still today. The biggest source of religious tension comes from the Islamic population that's coming into France. And this is all due to something called denationalization. After the fall of the Soviet Union, you had people from different countries traveling about, mixing. So nations are starting to lose their identity. And this is really critical for France because, as Caitlin mentioned, France is very ethnocentric. This means that religion is not just challenging other religion, it's challenging the idea of French identity as a whole, and it's kind of pulling apart at their ideas of being secular. One instance which you probably heard of was the minarets. Have you guys ever heard of that, the minarets in France, as well as the headscarves? So that was a big source of tension because it wasn't just about Islam coming into France, but it was about Islam becoming a part of French culture, which they did not want. The French kind of have this idea where we're secular as long as you come from the same background as we do. And a lot of that conflict that the French are having with Islamics, the Jewish in France as well are having a similar conflict because the Jewish people of France are very deeply rooted in their religion, as well as the Muslims of France. And so they're coming into conflict with each other as well. And it's resulting in this whole mess. And really what it all pertains to is a fight for cultural identity. And if you watch the news now, you can see this going on in France through all the different current events. And I'm going to segue now into what the French are really passionate about. Even though they're really passionate about religion, they really care about food way more. So Allie's going to talk about the cuisine.
Okay, so French food. France is a very artistic culture. You know about the Eiffel Tower. They have Impressionism, Monet, music, the Louvre, Paris. It's such an artistic city. And food is a representation of how artistic they are. Culinary arts is something that they pride themselves on. So today I'm going to talk about French food and wine, a little bit of the history, and then touch on a few points that I talked about in my research paper about their national identity and ethnocentrism. So they have created the culinary arts. Culinary creations, it's basically that food isn't just sustenance, but that food is a part of you, it's a taste. So Julia Child had this great quote that in France, cooking is a serious art form and a national sport. It's not just something that, let's go have dinner at the table tonight. It's let's cook and let's create a meal. So in the early 19th century, gastronomy is kind of what came about in French culture. Food at this point in time went beyond the general taste culture. Beforehand, France always prided themselves on their food. Many of you might have seen the Marie Antoinette movie or heard about, the quote of "let them eat cake." So food has always played a prevalent role in French culture. However, at the turn of the century, this is when gastronomy basically became a national phenomenon. And so food was no longer with the food critics, with the people that really prided themselves on how they could cook, but they started publishing about it, so people were talking about food. So taste was no longer just a sustenance issue. Also, with colonialism, the national resources that they had access to globalized. Suddenly there was this influx of foods from their colonies that they could integrate into their French food. So they also had better resources and more resources. Next I'm going to talk about their wine. Terroir is part of the wine culture that is really a big part of the French. They really pride themselves on having this excellent wine